notice, paraphrasing, a powerful verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, when Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says, in Jesus Christ, I think the way he actually phrased it, he says, in Jesus Christ we find the yes and the amen to every promise of God. Or putting it in more simple terms, Jesus fulfills every covenant promise that God has ever given prior in history to anybody. It's all summed up and fulfilled, and we can therefore say yes and amen to Jesus Christ. And that's what we'll be seeing over the next few weeks together. As we've walked through these various Old Testament covenants, we've seen how God is trying to woo this people, this bride, out of their complacency and their rebellion and their sin back to being a faithful covenant bride with him. And it doesn't usually last long, but those final words of the prophets, and yet the day will come, and yet the day will come, and new covenant will be there, and you will be my people, and a new heart will be. Paul says all those promises are finally given a yes and amen in Jesus Christ. That's where we're going for the next couple of weeks here. Welcome. We'll be looking at, in a way, Jesus in the Gospels, right? We're looking at Jesus. This is where we see Jesus' life, death, and resurrection most clearly. They'll be referred to in the letters here and there. But this is where we get the essence of Jesus' teachings and all. So we're dealing with Jesus. We're also dealing with the four Gospels as a genre. What is this kind of literature, this thing we call gospel? It's a genre unto itself. So we kind of, although Jesus is our fundamental feature and focus, I'll be talking about features of the Gospels as literature as we move through this time over the next 2 weeks. So let's start with the four Gospels. What is a gospel? It's a genre, it's a type of literature. Scholars debate exactly what kind of literature it is. For a number of years, many scholars argued that this is a completely unique type of literature, never before seen. In fact, up until about, I'd say, 30 years ago, all through the 20th century, that was the dominant view. Is that whatever gospel is, it's new, it's unique, it's something that was born because of Jesus. Like the disciples said, there's no type of literature that's adequate to do the job of telling Jesus' life, so we have to create this new type, called the gospel. More recently, I'd say the last 30 years, a number of scholars are saying, no, actually we've seen this type of literature before, and what it is basically Greco-Roman biography. That if you compare the Gospels to biographies of Jesus' time, there is a lot of overlap. So when Greg and I did our book, Jesus Loves, and we had to deal with this, we had a whole chapter on genre. And we concluded that while there is a lot of overlap between Gospel and Greco-Roman biography, that alone doesn't solve it. That there's a lot of overlap, but there is something new. So it's kind of a both-and position, we concluded. That we can learn a lot about these Gospels from understanding Greco-Roman biography, but something goes beyond that. Namely, that this literature ties back to the Old Testament. It is rooted in the Old Testament. We will miss, as we often do as modern-day Christians, we start reading the Gospels, and because we don't usually, at least a lot of us don't have a deep knowledge of the Old Testament, we miss so many allusions and references and echoes and even quotes of the Old Testament that make sense out of that. And it starts right with the word gospel itself. Anyone know what gospel means? Good news. It's the Greek word. The Greek word is euangelion in actual Greek. We translate it gospel. But it means good news. And I've seen scholars, like a really good scholar, a particular scholar I'm thinking of, who claims that all that means is just generic good news. Like, oh, something good is about to be told. I don't think that's, like, if we're just saying, oh, there's some general good news here, we're going to miss a lot of the import of what these authors mean when they say the gospel according to Jesus Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark, Matthew, etc. Because Because the phrase good news is being drawn directly from key Old Testament passages. It's not just generic good news, it's a particularly specific good news that was promised by the prophets long ago, particularly by Isaiah. Let's read Isaiah here. O Zion, messenger of good news. This is where the phrase gets taken from. Shout from the mountaintop, shout it louder, O Jerusalem, shout and do not be afraid. Tell the towns of Judah. Now here's the good news. Your God is coming. That's the good news. There's a particular, specific good news that Jews have been waiting to hear hundreds of years. This prophecy has been just kind of hanging in the air, waiting for fulfillment, and all of a sudden, our Gospels writers are saying, it's here. That good news Isaiah talked about, it's here. Our God has come. Yes, the sovereign Lord is coming in power. He's ruling with a powerful arm. See, he brings his reward with him as he comes. So we have a couple things here. God's coming, and he's sovereign, king. He's Lord, right? So there's a king dimension and a coming dimension. It's not just this passage. Isaiah, in another chapter, puts it this way. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings, there's the phrase again, good news, euangelion in Greek. The good news of peace and salvation, the news that God, the God of Israel, reigns. There's that king piece again. This isn't just generic good news. This is the news that God is now king. His kingdom is coming. It hasn't looked like it. Israel's been under oppression. They've been in exile. It doesn't look like God's been ruling the earth. It looks like foreign oppressors have. It looks almost like Satan has. But the good news is God's kingdom's coming now. He's coming with his power and with his might. And finally, Isaiah 61, 1 to 3. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for the Lord is anointed. There's that word anointed. Remember, kings are the ones who are anointed. So this is a king talking now. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim comfort to the brokenhearted, to proclaim the captives and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn, the time of the Lord's favor has come, the Lord's coming. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joy of blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, that's a covenant term meaning rightly related, properly related in covenant, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. That's the good news. It's Isaiah's good news. That God is coming, he's coming as king, he's coming with power, and he's coming to liberate. He's that kind of a king who brings liberation to those who mourn, to the brokenhearted, to the captive, to the prisoner. He reverses the state of those who are oppressed into liberation and freedom. That's the background. So that when Mark now, in chapter 1, verse 1, and Mark, we believe, is probably our earliest gospel. Probably the first gospel written was Mark. So the first sentence of the first gospel that we have written is this word. This is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. In other words, everything Isaiah said, I can tell you about that now. He has come. In Jesus Christ, the King has come. God has shown up. His reign has started, and liberation has come to the captives, freedom to the prisoners. Jesus' first sermon is fascinating. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 4. So the context here is Luke. In Luke, Jesus has just gotten baptized. He's just gotten tested by Satan. And he's coming now to Nazareth, his hometown. First words out of his mouth. First sermon of his ministry. And he comes into Galilee, into Nazareth. And it says he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. And the scroll of Isaiah was handed to him. And unrolling it, he found the place. So he's looking through Isaiah until he finds, I don't have the reference up there, but what he finds is the verse we just read from Isaiah 61. He found the place where it was written, and now he reads out loud. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he's anointed me proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, release of the oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. Of course they were, because of course the traditional way you would do synagogue is, while there would be prayers, a centerpiece was reading of the Torah, the scriptures. And as soon as someone would read, they would then sit down and give a little sermon, a commentary on what they just read. So they're waiting for the sermon. And here's Jesus' little mini sermon. It's supposed to be a commentary on the scriptures. Instead, he says, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. They weren't expecting that. You know, this is one of those texts when you read it, you talk about, yes, someday in the future, God will come. And Jesus said, no, that's done. Fulfilled. It's like, what? And they all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this the son of Joseph? Prophet's not without honor except in his hometown, right? How can you take this guy seriously? Maybe he's got a good sermon in him, but he can't really be the Messiah. And it's that bad then. I'm not going to read the whole text, but by the end of the chapter, they're trying to throw him off a cliff. Because Jesus had the audacity that when he went on with his little commentary and sermon, he didn't simply say it's fulfilled, but then he began to quote two passages from the Old Testament that shows that when God comes back, it's not just Jews he's coming back for, it's also Gentiles. And they did not want to hear that. Jesus instantly shows the Messiah is not just for Jews, he's for the whole world. And with that, great anger welled up, and they, like any good tribalistic group, us versus them, they want to hear about us and not them, and try to throw Jesus out the cliff. So Jesus, on his very first sermon, preaches about the good news that Isaiah has promised, and says, this is fulfilled in your own hearing. Here it is. Yeah.
Is it possible that when he reads from Isaiah 61 and they were amazed and spoke well of him, that they potentially saw that as hope, that he was giving them hope in their oppression under Roman rule?
Yes.
That he was saying, hang in there, or don't give up because today, I don't know, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think that would explain, one, how it sounds like they're so positive with him. In a few verses later, they turn on him. Because the difference would be, again, if you just think purely political earthly realm, which many Jews did of that day, then this prophecy was about getting Rome off our backs, right? And if Jesus goes, hey, this is fulfilled, it's like, whoa, seriously? Like tell us more. Like, Rome's going to be done, meaning Gentiles are done, don't go in. And all of a sudden, Jesus turns next and starts saying, oh, by the way, Gentiles are going to be saved too. It's like, you're not our enemies. That's the one we're supposed to be, you know, the Messiah's going to come and kill them, right? No, I'm coming to save them. So I think they're thinking political, Rome, and Jesus is thinking far bigger than that. The oppressor he's going to liberate from is a cosmic oppressor, not simply a Caesar. So yeah, I think that explains a lot of, I think that explains a lot of the Gospels. I think that explains why the disciples never got Jesus saying, I've got to be crucified. Because to them, if you're going to be crucified and dead, that means you're not going to be alive to defeat Caesar in Rome. And we need a live, living, victorious, powerful military Messiah. We don't need some guy dying on a cross. That's what happens to losers, not winners in the political machinery of the world. And Jesus, again, is flipping on the head of all the expectations. Not that he's, I mean, he wants to meet liberation expectations. It's just that his view of liberation is so much more cosmic than theirs. They're indexing this little piece of real estate on the eastern seaboard this year. And he's saying, I'm talking about all times, all places. I'm going for the one who's behind Caesar. And behind every political regime that ever oppresses anybody. God is coming. He's coming as king. And he will liberate all the oppressed. So that's this context for this idea of gospel. That's what the New Testament authors mean when they say gospel. What are the Gospels? I've heard it described this way, that the four Gospels are something like four unique portraits of Jesus. And I'm going to contrast that with two other images of artistic representation. Snapshots, like a photograph on one hand, and an impressionistic painting on the other. I don't think we can say that the Gospels are like photographic negatives, like a snapshot of Jesus, in the sense that there's more going on than just this purely descriptive, purely objective, disinterested, newspaper report about Jesus. It's not like that. These people are deeply invested in this man. I mean, for goodness sakes, they're giving their lives to this movement, and many of them will die for this. So it's not like they're just purely objective. But sometimes we, at least some people, and certainly some scholars, take that to mean that, oh, they're purely subjective. Like they're so in love with Jesus, they're just making up all this stuff about him that never really happened. That would be like more of an impressionistic painting. You really can't even tell what it is compared to the real thing until someone interprets it for you. One scholar actually wrote a whole article arguing that if you have these three images in your mind, it's the portrait. So what's a portrait? A portrait is something that's unique to the painter who does it. They bring their own style to it, but you can tell when you look at the portrait who it is. You don't have to go, what's that? And have the artist come. It's enough, close enough to the historical person you go, oh, I know who that is, but nonetheless you can see the creative details of the author bringing his own take to this person. And I think that fairly describes the four Gospels, because they're very different. Each of them have really different aspects to them. But as you come away from them, you go, they're talking about the same person. There was only one Jesus. It's just like four angles on a diamond, I suppose you could say. Four facets to this beautiful diamond of Jesus. And each of them bringing to light different aspects of who Jesus was, what he did. As Gospel of John says at one point, if everything had been written down that Jesus had done, all the books, the earth itself couldn't hold all the books that we could write about what this man did.
Some atheists take problems with the New Testament because they believe that it should be more biographical, meaning the writers take liberty and offer up interpretations of wisdom to things that Jesus said. And they're saying, well, if this is accurate, it should just be, like a biography.
Or newspaper report.
Yeah. So one of the things that they say is that, it can't be accurate because they're offering up all of this commentary. And how do they know, that is really what he meant when he said that?
Yeah.
And so the New Testaments, when you read them, it's interesting that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John interpret what Christ says in very much the same way, even though they were written, 20, 30, 40, 50, years apart.
Yeah.
I mean, they got the same nugget of wisdom from what Jesus said, from the other apostles.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think if you look at this from our cultural perspective, and what we wish we could find in a historical biography, and why don't we find that in the Gospels, right? And remember the context they were written in. They were written in a Jewish context when a disciple and rabbi relationship, we know what that was like from rabbinic Jewish writings. That a rabbi, and they called Jesus Rabboni, teacher, and he calls them disciple. That kind of relationship was very much one of pouring into so that the disciple could then authoritatively teach and instruct and interpret the master when they were apart from the master. That's what the point of being a master-disciple was in the rabbinic system. So their whole calling, to be called to follow Jesus, was eventually to be called to be able to interpret him correctly. You spend time with the master, watching his life, being shaped by his teachings, so that when you are set off on your own, you carry the master with you in a sense. They're authorized by Jesus to take his message. So, if you take it out of that context, then we go, what are these guys flying off at the mouth with about Jesus? Well, he mentored them into a way of seeing life and knowing his words and interpreting his actions so that he could pass this on. And that's what I think we don't have that really in this culture. We're so individualistic. We don't, I suppose there's context, we usually call them cults, when someone devotes himself that much to one person. But if it's son of God, it's okay, And that's what these people did. They gave their life to understand, live out, embody the teachings of this man and pass them on as he had instructed them to. That's why he called them as witnesses. The 12 were for that very purpose. So you're right, that is a piece that often gets pushed back. Another way of saying this is that the gospel writers are faithfully telling the same story of Jesus, because there's only one Jesus, but they're creatively shaping that telling according to the needs of their particular audiences. That's what brings out their creativity. See, Matthew is the only one of the four who is writing to a predominantly Jewish audience. So when you read Matthew, he's quoting Old Testament scriptures at 3 times the rate of any of the others, because he's trying to appeal to Jews who know their Old Testament. When you come to Luke, he's not writing to Jews, and so he's not quoting the Old Testament as much. He's making more appeals to Gentile-minded people, because that's his audience. John, who's written, we think, probably a couple of decades after the others, already knows the other 3 are circulating, most likely. So he's now writing things that are not covered in the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because that's already known in the church. He's giving teachings that aren't found in the other 3. So each of them have a unique purpose for why they're doing what they're doing. And you put them together, and you get these really different facets of this diamond, this beautiful life of Jesus. So who wrote these 4 Gospels?
May I ask one more question? I'm not sure how to ask it. I understand that there's a pretty big difference between the way that the Jews understood storytelling and their oratory continuing of that story, as opposed to the Greeks and the Romans who really valued written information. How did they put those 2 together? Do you have any idea how they put those 2 together as they created the Gospels? The Jewish tradition of storytelling and where they were now living in the 1st century in the Greco-Roman world that valued written information?
Well, as I've done more and more research on the oral traditional nature of these texts, I'm finding that until the printing press, really, not that long ago, a few hundred years, right up to the Middle Ages, till Gutenberg, the post-Roman world and up into the feudal world and all that was still predominantly what we call oral in nature. The elite, the literate, are becoming more and more dependent on written text, but the masses aren't predominantly literate, and so they're continually relying on oral tradition. Certainly this would have been the case in the 1st century. And so when we say the Greeks and the Romans are relying on literature, we're only talking about a sliver of them at the elite level, probably. The best estimates on this are by William Harris, who's done a significant study on literacy in the Roman world, and he argues that anywhere in the Roman Empire, at most you'd find 15% literacy rates in any one area, oftentimes only 3%. So even at best, 85% of your population are illiterate and can only have access to literate texts by oral public reading of them. And so I think the Jews, with Jesus, know that as they're moving town to town through Galilee, most of who they're going to find, again, we talked about that perhaps amongst Jews there's a higher literacy rate because they value sacred scriptures so much, and all of them wanted access, at least males were at least probably trained in synagogue. But again, half your population, women aren't. So at least half your population is only hearing oral. And so there's a mixture here of the written and the oral. The way I've heard it described is, particularly Mark, you see this in Mark, there's so much oral-like nature to Mark. The way he groups things topically, the way he'll do little word plays. Things you'd remember more easily than you would have to do if it was just going to be relying on written text. So Mark is probably what we would call a written transcription of an oral delivery of his gospel. And then the purpose of it was to send it away to another city, and they would take that and deliver it orally again. So it was just a moment of frozen oral performance, is how I think really of the Gospels. And that's how they're mixed, is that they become very valuable for transferring to another community. But once that text gets to the community, it's then written, read, and read out loud. And purpose of Scripture was always to get it inside and memorize and chew and meditate. So they try to get it on the inside of them and then begin to tell it in story form again, around campfire at night and in the synagogue or a Christian church meeting if it's the early Christians. So the written text is always just to transfer and then to get inside of new communities of Christians, I think, is predominantly how that worked. So, remember, in the ancient world, the word was powerful. And if the word's in you, that's the transformative powers, getting the word into your mind. And the mind becomes the all-important thing. Authorship of the Gospels. Who wrote these things? You want to say that, don't you? Here's the thing, though. They're anonymous. You and I have to be careful when we open our New Testaments to, let's say, the first Gospel. There it is, Matthew. Guess what? That's not in the text. And neither is Luke or Mark or John. Unlike Paul's letters, who Paul tells us who writes them, none of the Gospel authors are, quote-unquote, signed by any person. Which raises the question, why do we call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if the Gospels themselves are purely anonymous? Anyone know how we assign those names to those Gospels?
There are certain instances where one disciple said something about being with Jesus that the other ones weren't privy to.
Okay.
And vice versa.
Okay.
So they talk in generality about the same general story, but there are little differences in the specifics of the story that we believe would differentiate them.
Okay.
In terms of the relationship that they had with Jesus.
Sure.
We also know that the certain dates of the writing were different.
Okay.
Because they undertook writing it at different times. If I'm not mistaken, I think John was the last of
That's
the
what
four
most
to
believe
write.
John was last.
Yeah.
Mark probably written somewhere between 50 and 70 AD. Matthew and Luke coming next, somewhere probably between 70 and 80, and then John probably coming in the 90s somewhere. So between kind of the broadest spectrum would be 50s to 90s as these texts are being written of the first century. And yes, with Matthew and with John, remember, Matthew and John are the only two of the four gospel authors who, according to biblical tradition, had actually known Jesus. Mark and Luke, as far as we can tell from Scripture, never met Jesus. Luke was a Gentile physician, and he wasn't even converted until probably into Paul's ministry. But Matthew and Luke, as you read their Gospels, there's little clues. There's a place in Matthew, what we call Matthew, where it talks about Matthew the tax collector, and the way it talks about Matthew is different than all the other 12. It gives his profession, and Matthew the tax collector. So there's little clues that people thought, okay, that could be insignificant. But where we really get these from, these names, is from later church tradition. It's from 2nd century authors who tell us that they've heard passed to them from the original disciples who wrote these things. So the reason we have them written at the beginning of our Bible books isn't because they're actually in the text. It's because 2nd century authors told us this, And then we just put that in there to kind of alert readers who we think wrote this text. But I think it's important to know that unlike letters of Paul or letters of Peter, that these texts don't claim to be, they don't put a name on it, because see, for them, this is not their gospel. The gospel is not theirs. The gospel is Jesus's. And they don't want to confuse that. A letter is a different thing. A letter is a personal writing. They're simply standing back. They don't want the limelight. It's like Jesus is the good news, not me. And they don't even put their names on these things. So it's interesting. We get these things actually from later tradition. Papias is a major figure here. We believe he wrote probably in the first decade of the 2nd century. And Papias gives us the most information about who wrote which Gospels in a letter that he wrote. And he tells us that he actually sat with John. John, we believe, was probably the last disciple alive, the last one to live longest of Jesus of 12. And he says he actually sat with John once when John was traveling through his town, and he picked John's brain about who wrote these things, and John, he says, gave him this information. So if Papias can be trusted, and he's a very early source, Apostle John told him some of this information, and that's how we ended up getting this, was through Papias' letters.
Why do you think it took between 30 and 60 years for the
To start writing.
Gospels to start writing?
Good question. Yeah. So Jesus, we believe, dies around 33 AD. I mean, actually, we'll talk about that in a little bit. The year isn't quite as precise as we'd like it to be. But in the 30s, probably. Jesus dies and rises. And yeah, the first gospel probably doesn't come until late 50s, or maybe even into the late 60s. Why would they wait 30-some years, perhaps? Couple thoughts there. Some have said that they were so convinced Jesus was coming back soon that there's no point writing about this. We got to be telling people. So they just went on preaching, literally expecting the return of the Lord any day now.
In their lifetime anyway.
Yeah, and it's like as they get older, they realize, maybe he's not coming back in the next year. We have to pass this on to somebody. Like as soon as the apostles started dying, that's when they said, we got to get their thoughts down and actually have something to pass on. So what Papias and others tell us is this. Matthew, apparently, as a tax collector, would have been definitely illiterate. He would have had to have a trade literacy to be a tax collector. So it makes sense Matthew would have been one of the 12 to write. We know he could write. And then there's a tradition that Papias tells us that Matthew wrote notes while Jesus was teaching for that earthly ministry. Matthew was the note taker of the apostles. He kept kind of a written informal transcription of Jesus' teachings. So it makes sense he would be one of the ones to eventually write these down. John, the beloved disciple, obviously one of the closest, perhaps the closest to Jesus amongst his three inner circle, would make sense. Why Matthew, or why Luke and Mark, right? We're told by people in early church tradition that Mark was Peter's secretary. So what we're possibly getting through Mark is Peter's side of the story, key apostle for Jesus. And finally, why Luke? Well, Luke, of course, was a traveling companion of Paul. So in a sense, we could be getting something like Paul's version of the gospel through Luke, his traveling companion. So although we call it Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that is the traditional authors, we're in touch with traditions of Matthew's direct contact with Jesus, Peter, through Mark's secretary, Paul, his sense of the gospel through Luke, and then John, the beloved disciple. So really, very important tradition that Papias and others tells us that this goes back to the earliest folks.
Oh, I just had a thought. Is there a possibility that they didn't sign their Gospels also because they were afraid of Roman retribution?
Persecution.
Yeah,
That's possible.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you're putting your name on that.
Sure.
Everybody knows you wrote it.
Yep.
You know.
Yep. Yeah, it's certainly possible. These things are circulating widely. They're intended to circulate widely in hostile territory. And so there could be a dimension to that too. We know that the use of apocalyptic, for example, in the book of Revelation, apocalyptic was frequently used by persecuted Jews in persecuted contexts where they wanted to write symbolically so that one reason, so if Romans find it, they don't know really what we're saying. And they can't use it against us. So there is that concern that they have to be aware of. All right. So let's move into Jesus' life. What do the Gospels tell us? And we'll just kind of just chronologically move through Jesus' life and notice some of the more important elements that the Gospels share. Here's the context, the Holy Land during the time of Jesus. If you think of the Holy Land as roughly broken up into three areas: Galilee up in the north, Samaria, and Judea. And Jesus' ministry is predominantly going to take place up in Galilee, almost all of it. In fact, according to the Synoptic Gospels, and when we say Synoptic, we're talking about the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a title they've been given because they're so similar. Synoptic means literally to see the same. John's unique in ways the first three aren't. First three are much more in common. The Synoptics only record one journey during his ministry of Jesus going from Galilee down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. John records 3 separate Passovers. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke only record one Passover. If we didn't have John, we could easily assume Jesus' ministry lasted 1 year. It's the fact we do have John, and John records 3 cycles of Jesus going to Passover. That's where we get the number 3 years for Jesus' ministries from the Gospel of John. But that is Jesus' corridor here, is Galilee. So he's works primarily on the Lake of Galilee and then Sea of Galilee, out around there. So he's born in Nazareth, moves to the shores of Galilee for his ministry, works that territory, and then occasionally makes visits down to Jerusalem at the temple and back on up. And Jesus does go the short route. He goes through Samaria, where most Jews would go around Samaria to not be tainted with Samaritan uncleanness. But Jesus...
What's the physical distance between Galilee and Samaria? Just curious.
That is a good question. I'll look that up for next week. I got some miles for you.
Yeah.
It's, you hear about it in terms of a day's journey or something like that. Unless you go around, then it can be 2 days' journey. But so it's a good walk. But I'll try to find the miles on that. That'll be interesting. Interesting thing to know. So most of Jesus' ministry then is up north in the Galilee area. Again, born in Nazareth, which was a little, at least in the first century, a pretty small village. And is eventually going to move to the southern edge of the Sea of Galilee, where Peter lived, and is going to be based out of Peter's mother's house, according to the Gospels, and then start, really, a lot of what he does is right around the Sea of Galilee, occasionally making trips up north, occasionally crossing. Now this is interesting because the Jordan River here is really the eastern dividing side of the Holy Land. So when you cross the Sea of Galilee, which Jesus frequently does, you're crossing into Gentile territory, which means he's frequently enough doing ministry in places a Jew would think you shouldn't be doing ministry. Right? I mean, at one point he crosses over to Kersa, which...
Is that the one where the pigs?
Yes, like everything non-Jewish is going on over there, right? Pigs, a guy who's demonized in the tombs, like all this unclean stuff. And Jesus just goes right in there and ministers in the midst of what would be considered not a place for Jews to be hanging out. And Jesus is just loving on the demonized guy and freeing him. And Jesus constantly bucking the system of this is only for the Jews. No, it's for everybody.
Is that mileage of the rock mile, right?
Pardon?
Yes.
Is that again, the bottom of the map?
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Kilometers.
That one has some kilometers. Oh, I didn't even look. Was there a key on the other one?
No, I don't.
No? Whoops.
No, I don't think the other one had.
Oh. Okay. Can't go back. No, I didn't. Oh. Yeah, so on that one at least, you can see. Sea of Galilee is 20 kilometers long. A lot happens there, right? Jesus calms that sea. Ends up sleeping in a boat where the boat almost capsizes on that sea. One of the interesting archaeological discoveries, this is within the last 15, maybe 20 years at most, is one year, again, just within the last 20 years, the sea level, the water level of the Sea of Galilee, for some reason, this one year really went low. And when it sank, they discovered in the mud there a boat, and it's now been restored. And it was a fishing boat from probably around the 1st, 2nd century. And the dimensions, as they restored the boat, they found that called the draft of the boat, how tall, it was very, very low. And so they said, if you would have been out on this, in one of these boats like this, in a rough sea, it could easily have swamped. And so it was sort of a window into this moment when Jesus and his disciples were fishing out there. These weren't huge vessels. These were pretty small crafts that you could fit, 8, 10 people in at most, and could fill up with water very easily because of the low draft of the boat. So archaeology continues to occasionally give us some really interesting insights.
It's 68 miles from the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem.
Oh, okay, 68 miles. You Google. So, yeah, walking 68 miles, that's a good day's journey.
Also, the size of the boat were low because they had to bring their nets over.
Sure, yes.
They couldn't,
Right,
it had to
right.
be-
They didn't have a boom and winch going or something like that. Yeah. Okay, Jesus' birth. Whoops. Yeah, I'm sure. I haven't asked my sons what year they think Jesus was born. I guess it'd say 0. And then we have to have that discussion, well, there wasn't actually a year 0. It went right from -1, right from BC to 80, 1 to 1. But of course, we know that there's a problem with our calendars, that it wasn't probably Jesus being born in the year 1, because Josephus, if you ever want to have some fun reading, if you're an historical sort of person, read Josephus's 2 books. He wrote 2 books. So Josephus is the most well-known Jewish historian of the 1st century. He wrote 2 books between about 70 and 90 AD. So he's writing after Jesus has died and gone and risen. But within a few decades of that, and he's writing a history. One of his books is a history from the Old Testament right through to today. The other is just a history of the Jewish wars that happened in that 1st century. But just fascinating, important, detailed historical information we'd find nowhere else. If we didn't have Josephus, we'd know so much less about the 1st century world of Jesus. So he tells us, Josephus tells us about John the Baptist, and he tells us about Jesus, and he mentions all the historical, political figures of the day. So much information comes from Josephus. Well, one thing Josephus tells us is he tells us the year that King Herod the Great died. And he says Herod died in the spring of 4 BC. Now this is the guy who was alive when Jesus was born and tried to kill him. So that's why we know our calendars got messed up. Is our calendars are at least 4 years off, maybe more. I don't know if that disturbs you, but it shouldn't. It just means that a guy in the 6th century, about 525, when a pope asked him to do a new calendar with Jesus at the starting point, he was 500 years after Jesus, he just got the year wrong. He did his best. He was within 5 years, that's not bad, right? But we know he was off a few years. So it looks like somewhere between 7 and 4 BC is when Jesus actually would have been born.
Was Josephus always a Jew?
Yes. Yeah, he never became a Christian. So it's interesting, when he writes about Jesus, you gotta be careful here. So when he writes about Jesus, there's a whole debate about this. He mentions Jesus in twice in one of his books. And one of them is a good paragraph about Jesus. But as you read it, you go, oh, this guy's a Christian. So he says things like, he was the Son of God. He says, it sounds like he's saying he was like, almost acknowledging he was raised from the dead. But what we know is Josephus wasn't a Christian. So what it looks like happened is that early Christian copyists who were copying Josephus added a few sentences in to to say what Josephus should have said about Jesus. When you pull the Christianized statements out, the passage flows really nicely, and it sounds like what a Jewish person would have said. So we believe we can reconstruct pretty accurately what Josephus probably said. And what he did say is that Jesus did miracles. I mean, Josephus talks about a number of people doing miracles in the first century. That wouldn't surprise him. But he does say that Jesus did miracles. He says that Jesus was crucified under Pilate. And he says that his followers continued to follow him even after he died, which is as much as you can get a Jew to say is, well, they think he's still alive to follow. Now, I don't think that, but they do. So he's reporting pretty accurately on some important parts of Jesus' life and even his death.
Is there any historical, other than the Bible, anything that talks about people coming back from the dead right after Jesus died in the crucifixion?
Oh, that
You know that part in the Bible?
Mark 27 where they
Yeah.
rise up from the graves.
You never hear anybody talk
No.
about it, but it seems like that should be such a big deal.
Yeah, like, who else is mentioning this sort of thing?
Somebody was writing, I would remember that.
Yeah, yeah. And Josephus doesn't mention that, which is interesting.
And nobody else does other than.
No, and that,
us.
see, part of the problem with any ancient history, but certainly something like ancient history of, for us, as Christians, we think of Israel as pretty important. But it was just sort of a little backwater country for the Roman Empire, right? So what survived is Roman annals and Caesar writing related, not much about a little country on the eastern seaboard. So we thankfully have Josephus, and that was his country, so he wrote a lot about Israel. But other than Josephus, we just don't have hardly anything written about Israel in detail. Tons about the Caesars and over in Rome, but not much about Israel. So that's part of the problem. We just don't have much that's been recovered from the ancient world regarding Jesus' time. It's fascinating what we have recovered that does talk about Jesus. There's at least 7 ancient texts other than the Bible written by non-Christians that talk about Jesus in some way or form.
Where did they get this 7 to 4
Oh,
BC?
okay.
Because King Herod sent soldiers to kill babies in Bethlehem 2 and under,
Yeah.
and he died in, did you say he died in 4 BC?
He died in spring of 4 BC.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
I heard 80 in my head.
Oh,
Never mind,
okay.
never mind. Got it.
So the 4 BC is the one end, because that's when he died. Why they push it back to 7? There's several reasons. If we had more time, it would be fascinating just to go into the question of the date, like how narrow, how much can we narrow this down? And one of the interesting questions is the whole Bethlehem star phenomenon. And there's been a number of books written by astronomers who say that between 12 BC and 6 BC, maybe 5 BC, so right into this span of a few years here, some really strange astronomical phenomena are going on. Like you don't even need to posit a supernatural star. We know that some really weird stuff happened all around this time. It was 12 BC. I'm guessing with dates here, but it's within this 5-6 year span. I think it was Halley's Comet was around 12 BC. Then between 6 and 7 BC, there was this weird, like it happens every like 800 years or something, but 2 or 3 things that happened every 800 years happened all within 2 years. One was a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the Pisces sky, which meant 3 times those 2 planets lined up in that part of the sky, which is very rare. And the argument is that what a ancient person who watched the stars and did symbolism would have thought was Saturn, because of Saturday, frequently was thought of as the Jewish day because they worship on the Sabbath, Saturday. Jupiter was the sign of the king, the planet of the kings. And so as these align, and then Pisces had something to do with the Jews too, for some reason. So it's like aligning and saying the king of the Jews has come 3 times in like this few months. And so, some of these people writing these are secular scholars, they're not Christians, they're saying, yeah, this could easily been interpreted by astrologers as something's very important going on over with the Jews here. A king has come. So it's interesting to see how a lot of phenomena, celestial and Herod, we know his date, and it all kind of coagulates around these few years right here. Interesting stuff. So, we have to look at the 2 different accounts here, right? Because, whoa, no, it's not 7:30. It's 6:40. 5-minute break. Then we'll see what Matthew says. Boy, we're in trouble. We'll be lucky if we get to Jesus' 12th birthday.